Private property and the protection of our heritage. Hello, I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel from Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined today by Lord Inglewood, Vice President of the National Churches Trust and former Junior Heritage Minister, Chair of the Reviewing Committee for the Export of Works of Art. And Richard, you have also got personal experience of the stewardship of heritage property as the owner of your own country house. So thanks very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks very much for having asked me to join you. I'm looking forward to it.
The theme of our discussion today is going to be balancing private and public interests in heritage, along with regulatory effectiveness. And we'd just like to start, first of all, by speaking about your obvious lifelong interest in heritage protection. How would you summarise your career and experience in the field?
Well, I was fortunate enough to be brought up in a Grade 1 listed building and in a family who were interested in these things. For example, my father was one of the first members of the Historic Buildings Council, i.e. Commission of English Heritage, way back in the 1950s. And subsequently, really throughout my schooling, university and work, I've been, again, very lucky enough to have been close to, for a lot of the time, very important listed buildings. And finally, as my father's heir, I became responsible for my family home. And suddenly I discovered, which was quite a concentration of, was that the buck stopped with me.
How much of a challenge has it been with the buck stopping with you?
Well, the things ceased to be theoretical and become real and actual practical problems that I had to face with the rest of the family. Well, what we did, we'd agreed among ourselves, including my father before he died. And so that is one aspect of it. And the other thing was a combination of being in the right place at the right time and having an interest and a little genuine understanding. I'm not an academic of these topics, meant that I got some lucky breaks.
What were the lucky breaks?
Well, I became a junior minister in the Department of National Heritage. Somebody else turned the job down. I got the job as chairman of the Reviewing Committee, I think because I had worked with, quite closely, some of the people involved in the selection process. So it wasn't quite insider dealing, but they knew more about me than they may have done about others.
This is the story of everyone's career ever. It's how it works.
Yes.
And I mean, I happen to have in my hand a sort of the Protecting Our Heritage consultation paper, which was produced when you were the junior minister. And some of its proposals are just being put into legislation in the last year or two. So it shows even the heritage protection law takes as long as heritage.
Well, as you say, I was the junior minister at that time, and therefore, behind the arras, I'd have had quite a lot to do with it, although I suspect if I reread it, I wouldn't necessarily recognise what I said in detail there. I think the basic framework of what is set out there is still the basic framework around the heritage protection rules for quite a lot of our national heritage, and it stood the test of time. I mean, there's always the problem about whether government actually implements its own policy in this respect.
I think one element of that is that a great deal of our important heritage buildings, land and art is privately owned. And perhaps just looking at generally, and we'll come on to particular matters in due course, is that private ownership a good thing? And how far does the state need to intervene to protect the heritage interests?
I don't think it's a bad thing, but I think you actually slightly posed the wrong question.
Okay.
I think that in the context of the world in which we live now, it is inevitable. The state cannot, even if it was desirable, embrace everything. I happen to think for various general reasons, even if it was able to, it shouldn't. And when carried out most effectively, I suspect that looking after the heritage is done very well by private people, for much the same reason that you can't create great art by committee. You need to have, if I can put it this way, an enlightened dictator in charge. And that's the way you will, I think, look after things better and also enhance the magic of some of these places better than if it's got a slightly dead-hand bureaucracy hanging on to it.
Can we go back for a moment to your experience as the chair of the Reviewing Committee for the Export of Works of Art, thinking about private ownership and public ownership of art? Would you say that the UK's export controls for art and cultural objects strike a good balance between protecting national heritage but also respecting private ownership, as well as encouraging the art market?
If you're going to have a system of export control for, shall we call them, great and important cultural objects, you've clearly got to have a workable system. In parentheses, it's worth noting that the United States doesn't. It's normally countries whose economic fortunes are on the decline that introduce these systems. And in our case, the whole system in its genesis was stimulated by the German economy getting better than our economy in the late 19th century. And it was a lot of stuff going both to Germany and to America that made the leaders of the day think it was important that we didn't lose everything from this category of items. And of course, in those days, it was quite clear that heritage, national importance, and world heritage and world museums, like the British Museum, were integral to identity of a country such as ours. So having said that, is a good balance struck. And I imagine the reality is you could never find a system that will please everybody under all circumstances. But it's interesting that if you go back and look at the Waverley Committee, that is the progenitor of the existing system, they were very able people who were working against a background where these ideas have been floating around for quite a long time. And it's quite interesting that if you look at the 5 members of the Waverley Committee, 4 of them are in the Dictionary of National Biography in their own right. And the other, Mrs. Dalton, her husband, has an entry. And they did craft, and it must be credit to Anderson, the chairman, and the other members of the committee, a pretty sophisticated system, which has stood the test of time. What else in public life is more or less unchanged and been in place for now towards 70 years?
I suppose I just have the experience from working with overseas buyers of objects who buy things, in completely good faith in the UK, and then they just want to take them home, and their home is not in the UK. So this is obviously the crux of the problem for people in the UK art market.
It certainly is. And if you aspire in this country to have a bit of the world art market in place, it is obviously something you're worried about. The counterpoint is, well, caveat emptor. The rules are absolutely clear. And when people are disappointed like this, then whose fault's that? Did they not take proper advice? Did they not actually look into the background? In fact, having said that, I have some personal sympathy. You go somewhere, you buy something, you think you've got it, and then it disappears. But if we have a system of some sort of export control like this, that is inevitably going to happen. And it's not really unfair. As I said, first of all, it's caveat emptor. Secondly, the system is transparent. And thirdly, it doesn't mean, as in some countries, that the state has a simple right of preemption over anything. And if a purchaser from abroad buys something and a matching offer isn't forthcoming, they can have it.
There is, however, the point that the whole system definitely steers us towards public ownership in this case. So it is, without doubt, it's a biased system.
Yes, the system is, in any event, an intrusion by the state into the workings of a marketplace. And on top of that, the reality of the system is that if a matching offer is forthcoming from the UK, it is likely to be from a public institution, principally because of access requirements, although private individuals can engage. And as long as they provide the public access, then the criteria are met.
What used to be known as the Ridley rules, where an individual person can pop up and say, I'll save this for the nation, I'll buy the object and I'll lend it to a gallery.
I think there is a wider tendency, I won't say bias, towards public ownership if you look at the mechanisms for raising money. Because, and it's true equally of things like acceptance and lieu, where you can pay your tax bills by handing over works of art. Because it's a one-way street. The money, de facto, is always public money, which is then moving things into the public sector. And I'm not sure, in the reality of the world we're in now, you can avoid that. Having said that, if a private buyer in an English marketplace, in an open market, outbids a foreign buyer, in the context of a domestic sale, the private buyer wins, however emotionally distraught the public sector might be. So it's a difficult one and it's a complicated one, but show me somewhere else in the world that has got a system that is more even-handed. It's interesting, when I went over to France with the reviewing committee to talk to the French authorities about what they were doing, they basically modelled their update of their system of control within the framework of French law and French administration, very much on what we were doing.
So gratifying.
So that's an achievement.
It is. It's one of the very few instances where they have followed our lead without being forced. The reality of life is there are always people with grievances of one sort and another which reflect to particular instances of being hard done by or being felt to be hard done by, and you find them in the context of the reviewing committee and its work, as with everything else. But the general view, as I understand it, stood it when I was chairing it and subsequently, is that on balance, it works pretty well most of the time for most people and is generally considered fair.
I mean, there's always an element of balance, and I think thinking of sort of heritage property and historic houses, do you think the balance is being struck right in terms of the private ownership in the way in which the state sort of helps? Or
I mean, I now speak both as somebody who is interested in it sort of systemically and also as somebody who's actually dealt with it, because my home is conditionally exempt and I have a maintenance fund to support it. The concept, I think, is a fair one, and it goes right back to the Guy's report in the 1940s. It was endorsed by the document you referred to in your opening remarks. The difficulty, as ever, as you all know as well as anyone else, is that the devil lies in the detail. And there are two aspects really of that. There are things to do with conservation, access, looking after the things. And if private people are going to do it, and there's going to be a separate category of objects in that group, then that must be properly done transparently. But then there's secondly the detail of the tax framework that surrounds it, where minutiae in the tax law can have absolutely devastating impact. And in my view, there are a number of those, which means that the system will not work as well as it could or should unless slight adjustments were made. I'm particularly thinking about in the context of country houses, many of which are in places where nobody would dream of conducting a commercial operation. You can't move them like a shed, which you have a supermarket. You've got to somehow find a way to endow them. And if you want the previous family to, or for that matter, anybody else to endow it, you feel, I think, that it is appropriate that the tax treatment of the revenues from the endowment should be treated in exactly the same way as if they were coming from, say, a charity, because the purposes for which they're being applied are inherently charitable. And no, that doesn't happen. And so if I am a charity giving money to look after an important historic building, the money is handed over and you get tax relief. If the money in my family's maintenance fund is deployed not on me, but through me as the owner for the time being on the historic building, not only is there no tax relief in the equation, you actually have to pay income tax on it. Well, if ever there's a disincentive not to do something, that is the case. And it was not, when the system was established, the rule at that time. It was, I think, a piece of collateral damage to some tax changes in the 1990s, which was completely unintended.
I suppose, to play devil's advocate, the point is that private owners do become enriched, even though the purposes of the spending of that money may be charitable. It doesn't result in the private owners benefiting because of this thing that, I mean, it's right there in the HMRC guidance, Capital Taxation of the National Heritage, where they say that successive governments have taken the view that, as far as possible, heritage property should remain in private hands. And obviously, owners should be encouraged to care for it and look after it and display it to the public. But the point is that all of these tax incentives that we have for looking after our heritage property are there, principally in the first instance, to ensure that private owners continue to own their own stuff privately.
No, I don't think that's quite right. I think the tax incentives are there in order that the buildings or the object of the fund or whatever it is are properly looked after. Things have to be channeled through individuals. And in the case that I've been talking about, in the case of the privately owned historic buildings, they have to be channeled through the owner for the time being. And it's not the owner who benefits, because the actual application of the money is not on him himself as a private person. And if you don't think that private ownership is the answer in this context, you've then got to come forward with a realistic alternative. And they don't seem to be, because if you don't, the things will cease to exist. And not merely us in our generation, but future generations won't have them. Once the thing's gone, it's gone forever. Now, I heard an anecdotal story of a man who had, I think a very rich man, probably the country has, and he went to the National Trust, and they said, well, we'll take it off you, but we want an endowment of £14 million. Which he replied, if I had £14 million, I wouldn't be coming to you asking you to take it off my hands. You need to find ways of incentivizing people to do the right thing. And it is my view that this particular provision is a very serious disincentive to that. And it didn't really make huge difference during the recently passed era when inheritance tax was so low. Now that inheritance taxes have come in, people will suddenly think, actually, no, we're not going to. It's going to cost us too much, because clearly any private person, be it you, me, or the Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, we have priorities such as our family, as well as these other things.
And just in terms of the Heritage Maintenance Fund, as I follow it, you sort of indulge in trust. The problem you're drawing attention to is that the income that fund gets is taxed.
I think so. I mean, if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck, and to have to pay for the income leaving the maintenance fund and to go into the heritage property to be halved in value, is not an encouragement to set the fund up in the first place. What we're thinking about here actually is quite a long-term process. And what we're doing is we're spiking our nose to spoil our face because we're too short-term. And short-termism in this, as in an enormous number of other things in this world, is actually very dangerous and counterproductive.
Just going back to the tax incentives and schemes like conditional exemption and acceptance in lieu, do you believe they adequately support private owners in preserving the heritage assets, which is something that we all agree is a common good?
I think each scheme has to be seen on its merits, but something like acceptance in lieu, provided you have fair valuations, seems to me to be an entirely good scheme. What matters is whether it's a fair do. Now, interestingly, and Richard, you'll know more about this than I do, my understanding is that in the early days of compulsory purchase, there used to be 10% sweetener paid to the people whose land was taken, because that was thought to be an intrusion into private property rights that ought to be recognised. It's not a very fashionable perspective these days.
Well, it was taken away and it's now been put back in as a loss payment of up to 10%, although there's some caps on that. So it's a little bit of a sweetener.
There's something to be said for spending a small amount above and below the bare minimum in order to achieve something which is desirable and in the long run, and which may founder because of the over-pernickety approach of the people who control the nation's money. The lesson of history about many of these things is that if it's expensive to buy, it turns out to be cheap in the long run.
And so do you think that the government should be doing more to support private owners of heritage property to balance the repair and maintenance responsibilities with financial sustainability?
The key to the long term is financial sustainability. And I think what is appropriate is that there should be an even-handedness of approach between the public sector, the third sector, and the private sector. And if you build in proper safeguards, I simply don't see why you can't achieve that. Obviously, if the private sector sells, then there has to be clawback for tax deferred. But that's no different from somebody receiving a lottery fund and then it going wrong, be it a charity or be it a private person, and having to pay back the money that's given out. If you want to do this, and if there's a will, there's a perfectly good way, pretty obviously in front of you.
Have you ever thought of greater collaboration with charities or the private sector, how that could work, how that could be encouraged?
As a general rule, I think that collaboration is a very good thing, and it's true in this sector as in many others. One of the difficulties, and I think the private sector has faced, is that the public sector and the third sector tend to think private ownership is a bit of a pariah, and as a result don't necessarily except in the mutual debate about what is desirable, that their interests are given the credit, the value that they deserve. But yes, I mean, there are obvious difficulties, for example, about charities handing money to private owners for doing things which are within the terms of their charitable purposes. It happens, in fact, and I think it's a good thing. You've got to have the proper safeguards to ensure that if things go wrong, the money is returned to the original charity. And I think that if we approached the whole thing from that perspective, we would in fact find the thing would work better, both more smoothly in the short run, and actually in the longer run, we would save more of the things that really matter. As an aside, one of the problems about thinking about heritage and its protection is knowing where you draw the line, because we can't preserve everything. It simply isn't feasible, nor is it desirable. I mean, all the current political debate about growth is very important. We must have growth. But at the same time, I think it is responsible towards posterity in order to keep the best of what we've got now.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of sense of having I suppose, a bit of a mixed economy. We can all think of situations where private owners, either long established or just come in and bought the property, have then done huge things and successfully and saved it and care greatly. I can also think of situations where private owners have come in with the intention of saving the property and they've simply not managed to do it. And there's been a need to look at some form of charitable trust coming in, or a lot of public money coming in behind that to achieve it.
I think that's right. I mean, it cuts all ways. Sometimes very ambitious commercial projects from a heritage protection perspective are absolutely ghastly. And we need to remember that. The idea that the commerce is the way out of this particular impasse, I think, is not true. Equally, as you say, things can work for a little bit and then they collapse in on themselves. And that is not good in the long term for what you might call heritage assets. Long-term sustainable management is really what we need. And of course, the public sector is one of the worst in the general context of looking after its heritage assets. I work some of the week in the Palace of Westminster, and frankly, it is absolutely scandalous the way in which that building has not been properly looked after for generations. And it ill behoves people in government or people in Parliament to give lectures to other people about looking after the heritage properly, when things like the current condition of the Palace of Westminster are allowed to continue. They should be leading by example, and I'm not sure they are.
Yeah, it's that sense of sort of an institutional building, even in a slightly sort of private ownership sort of sense, judges' lodgings and the like. You have a feeling no one's really spending so much money on them.
Yeah, let's not pretend it's easy. But nevertheless, if they won't do it themselves, they ought to enable other people, whoever those other people might be, to do it and achieve the nationally desired outcome. Almost every single example we can look at is in detail different. That's one of the problems. There is no kind of bog standard template. And you have to take these things case at a time. And that involves individual judgment, be it at its lowest level on listing buildings. I used to do a bit of that as a minister. And I remember being told by my Secretary of State the advice she was given by a Secretary of State when she had been in my role, which was, if you like it, list it. There is inevitably an element of subjective judgment related to the fact that people are people and everything's different.
We talked all about finance, but coming on to the sense of the regulatory side, listed buildings being one example of that. How do you think that balance works between the state regulating and the private owner? Is it just right, or is it too strong? Is it too weak?
I think it's terribly difficult. I mean, the whole thing has become very bureaucratic, as has the world more generally. And that is a mistake, but I can see why and how it's happened. I think in the last analysis, the best conservation is carried out by people who would have done roughly what the informed state suggests it should do without ever having to go near them. These things are all, to a greater or lesser extent, labour of love. And you've got to have a commitment to doing it. We also know that, for example, that the absence of overall coverage of conservation officers and things throughout society is making it very hard for people who want to do the right thing and may themselves not be entirely sure what the right thing might be. And it's all a muddle. Perhaps life always has been a bit of a muddle in this sort of respect. And it's a bit of a lottery as to which important buildings and collections survive and which don't. But you've got to try and make sure as best you can, I think, that the high-quality ones do survive, because those are the ones that are going to give the biggest pleasure and benefit to future generations.
And this is clearly what the government guidance is trying to do, going back to that quote from capital taxation, where HMRC is saying private hands, the current custodians of these buildings are perhaps best placed to look after them in the long term. And so I suppose if you, Richard, were advising the next heritage minister, what would you advise them? What would be your top priority for ensuring long-term preservation of the UK's cultural property?
I would tweak the existing legal political framework, and I would encourage the public authority responsible for overseeing these things to develop a more intimate partnership arrangement with the people concerned. I have, in my own home, I have to report annually to HMRC what's going on, and quite right too. A letter goes in, and I get a response, and that's about it. And every now and then, various representatives from government agencies come and look round. What they're basically doing is sort of checking that I haven't sold the silver knives and forks behind their back. What I believe should happen is that you should be able to build up a mutually friendly relationship with the regulator, who comes in much more constructively, and between you, it's a partnership. Now, I think this is currently pie in the sky for the very simple reason that Historic England is really under the cosh financially. It can't employ enough people to do that because of the dire state of public finances and all the other calls on public money. But I would like to see a more harmonious relationship between the state and, for that matter, both the third sector and the private owner, so that they don't have an adversarial relationship, which is not by any means always the case, but there are instances of it. And if they could work together, I think you would actually end up with a better system which would work more smoothly to the advantage of everybody.
Well, this is the song we always sing. If we can all work together in the same direction, things will be smoother.
It's a truism to say if you're all working on the same side, things go better.
Well, on that harmonious note, Richard, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.